That is one of the great counterfactual questions, I think. If you look at why the chip industry has this deep interconnection with Asia that it has today, that dates from the earliest days of the industry. So Fairchild Semiconductor brought its first commercial chip to market in the early 60s, and at the exact same time was opening its first assembly facility in Hong Kong, precisely because of the wage differential. You could pay someone in Hong Kong at the time 25 cents an hour. It was a tenth of the wage you get in the US. And Fairchild tried to manufacture in the US. They went to the backwoods of Maine. They opened a facility on a Navajo reservation in New Mexico. Anywhere they could find cheap labor, they tried, but nothing was as cheap as they could get in Hong Kong, and then eventually Singapore, Taiwan, elsewhere in Asia. But next to the cost differential, you had an active strategy of governments in the region trying to pull in US chip makers, both because they realized that it was a great source of jobs for all of the farmers who were leaving the countryside looking for employment in the cities, and because they wanted to anchor the United States more firmly in their country. So if you look at the Taiwanese government, the Singaporean government, they were all thinking of the chip industry not only in economic terms, but also as a way to keep the US interested in their security. And think of Taiwan, for example, in the late 1960s, early 1970s, the US was losing the war in Vietnam. Nixon was discussing publicly a drawing down of US commitments from Asia. At the same time, Kissinger was going to visit mainland China, beginning the process of shifting recognition away from Taiwan towards Beijing, a moment of immense risk for Taiwan. And so Taiwanese leaders asked themselves, what's the best strategy in this new world? And the conclusion they reached was the more US investment, the better. And the best place to get US investment was in the electronics sector. And the rationale was Americans might not want to defend Taiwan, but they'll be willing to defend Texas Instruments if it has a facility outside of Taipei. So that was a key driver, and still is a key driver up to this day, of why we have so much chip industry footprint in East Asia. And when Morris Chang was passed over for the CEO job in Texas and was looking for something else to do, he was in his 50s, already very successful, had really built the chip industry himself. He was approached by the government of Taiwan, which is a country he'd been to only a couple of times in the context of Texas Instruments business trips. So his relationship with Taiwan didn't extend beyond his status as a former TI executive. But they came to him and said, would you like a blank check to build a chip industry in Taiwan? And he said, that sounded like an interesting proposal.
And that's a huge turning point. One has to ask oneself if Texas Instruments made that decision on a rational basis. Because clearly he'd already established a formidable reputation for his meticulousness. He was a perfectionist, which you have to be in this business. Why do you think he didn't get the job of Texas Instruments CEO?
I think there are two explanations, maybe more. One, some people suggested it was because he was Chinese. He himself, and I interviewed him for this book, said that actually when he moved from Massachusetts to Texas, he found much less discrimination in Texas than he had experienced in Massachusetts, and really downplayed how different it was being a Chinese American in Dallas. But that's one possibility that some people have proposed. The other, which I think is certainly part of the answer, is that Chang had a new and revolutionary idea for chip industry business models. Up to that point, all chips were designed and manufactured by the same company. But Chang wanted to do something different. He, as early as the mid-1970s, was trying to get his colleagues at Texas Instruments to start what would later be called a foundry model. In other words, manufacturing chips for lots of different customers. Anyone who wanted to design a chip could come and manufacture. And at the time, his colleagues at TI said, well, Morris, that's an interesting idea, but there are no companies that just design chips and are looking for manufacturing services. And he said, well, if we build the capacity, there'll be lots of firms that would prefer to design and trust the manufacturing with us, because manufacturing is capital intensive, it's hard to do, and there are huge economies of scale that accrue to it. And that was the business model he wanted to implement at TI, and it was something that TI leaders just couldn't get their heads around. But when the Taiwanese government came to him and said, what should we do for our semiconductor business, knowing much less than he did, they were happy to give him a whole lot of money to build this entirely new business model in Taiwan.